And a very good morning to you. We're live in London and you're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today here at Midori House, my guests Nina dos Santos and Isabel Hilton share their views on the week's biggest stories. Very good morning to you both. Nina, what have you spotted?
Good morning. I'm really interested in Keir Starmer heading over to Italy to meet Giorgia Meloni on Monday. All of this, even though they're from different sides of the political spectrum, I think basically he's trying to learn from her immigration policies and see if anything can work in the UK.
Thank you for that, Nina. And how about you, Isabel? Fresh off a plane from Taipei.
Indeed, yes. And so, not surprisingly, my gaze is being directed rather further east. So I'm interested in some fresh manoeuvres around the marine, kind of the slow motion marine war that's going on in that part of the world, so East China Sea. The Nikkei has reported that the Chinese have set up a new institute to study Okinawa and are questioning Japan's sovereignty.
Thank you very much indeed for that. We'll also hear from Monocle's Istanbul correspondent with the latest headlines.
I'm Lucinda Smith, and coming up later I'll be bringing you the news from Turkey, including Ankara's application to the BRICS bloc, why thousands of dead fish are washing up in the Bay of Izmir, and how a religious minority is finally having their places of worship recognised.
Plus, Monocle's editorial director Tyler Brûlé will join us on the line from Stockholm today. It's the 15th of September 2024. Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you. Thank you for tuning in today. And thank you, Nina dos Santos and Isabel Hilton, for coming in, especially, Isabel, the fact that, 9 hours ago, you'd just fallen off a plane. Well, not literally fallen off a plane, but you had just landed.
I had just landed. I had landed at a rather dysfunctional Heathrow airport where all communications appear to have been severed.
Okay, we'll touch on this briefly because we're just about to hear from our editorial director, Tyler, who'll be, he'll have his own view on transport, different sort of types and qualities of transport. But you had 23 hours of perfect transit.
It was wonderful, being very well looked after on a very long flight through Bangkok from Taiwan, Bangkok, London. It was very pleasant.
And then
I hit Heathrow. Yes.
Excellent. And then we just don't need to talk about that. How's your week been, Nina?
Great, yep. Lots of different things I've been talking about on Italian television. Talking about everything from the royal families, interpersonal dramas as Harry hits 40 years old, to, Taylor Swift endorsing Kamala Harris.
Keeping it classy, Italia.
Quite.
I mean, how are they
eccentric, which is always par for the course there.
Are they still absolutely bananas on the royal family?
Yeah, I think the royal family is actually, Italy is one of the countries that is extremely interested in the royal family. They're extremely popular over there. I think the only other types of stations I've reported for in terms of TV throughout my career that are crazier than the royals are obviously the Americans. The Italians just like to follow every single twist and turn in the drama, particularly between the two princes, William and Harry, amid, this suggestion that Harry might want to present himself back at court and come back into the royal fold as the prodigal son. But apparently William, his brother, is having none of it, reportedly.
And we've caught up with that. Thank you very much for that, Nina. Let's head to Stockholm now. Our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, is there for us. A very good morning to you, Tyler. How are you?
Good morning, Em. I'm very well. Sunny day here in Stockholm. Definitely, it is super autumnal. They say it's going to get warmer, but it's just one of those magical days that you get on this side of the Baltic, 18, 19 degrees, cloudless. All of the Swedes are out jogging, pushing prams out for their morning constitutionals.
Sounds bliss. You have been a resident of the realm of the perpetually airborne this week, haven't you? Where have you been?
Well, I sort of feel like maybe it could be that Isabel's following me or the other way around. I was in Bangkok, of course. We checked in last Sunday. I didn't quite hit Taipei. That was part of the plan. In fact, I left one of my colleagues behind. He went from Tokyo down to Taipei a little bit earlier today. So we are doing a little bit of business in Taipei. But I went up from Bangkok to Hong Kong and left Tokyo yesterday. And so I'm not quite back at base in Zurich yet, but we'll be by tomorrow late afternoon.
Taking little steps here, but here and there. We do need to ask, in your column this week, you did mention the reason for your changing hotel room in Bangkok. Talk us through that.
Of course, this was a story which of course, attracted headlines many weeks ago. There was this murder-suicide in room 502 at the Grand Hyatt in Bangkok. It's a lovely bungalow poolside. It's been my residence, my perch when I've been going to Bangkok, certainly for the last 10, 12 years. And it was interesting because our correspondent, Gwen Robinson, when this happened, she said, "Oh, you don't have to worry. Should it happen in one of the suites upstairs?" Then, of course, we saw the photos of the Bangkok Post. I recognized a Lazy Susan in the living room, and of course saw the bodies being removed with 502 on the door. And I thought, look, maybe it's just time that we can let the air clear a little bit. I'm sure I will return at some point, but I decided to go to the Rosewood down the street instead.
I would suggest that was a bad idea, because it wasn't just one person. It was a total of 6 people, wasn't it?
There were 6. There was cyanide involved. I'm sure all of the surfaces have been wiped down many weeks ago. And as I said, I'm not, I don't get spooked that easily, but I thought, yeah, we can give it a miss this trip. Maybe we'll revisit another time, but I don't think I need to stay in room 502 again.
No, they may have to sort of change the number on the door. And it does raise that question, doesn't it? That what do you do with a room where, well, 6 people have died in? Because you do hear of tales about gruesome things happening in hotel rooms and hotels having to reconfigure not necessarily the layout, but a broom cupboard suddenly appears in the map of the hotel, which had once been the room where the dreadful deed took place. Do you ever talk to sort of like people in hospitality about what you do when something dreadful happens?
Yeah, I remember talking to a GM in Geneva, of course, being a diplomatic hub and, of course, a place where all sorts of things go on. And when they talk about the removal of bodies, not necessarily homicides, but just how do you get a body out of a room? What time do you do it? How is it done? And because, of course, we're used to sort of complaining about late check-ins and things like that and getting angry with front desk staff. But often we should, pause for a moment and think about everything that happened between 2 a.m. and 5.
Okay, so they're trying to get the cadaver out of the back stairwell. Let's move on to the rest of your week. So you were bouncing around. So you went to Hong Kong. How was Hong Kong feeling?
Listen, I think there's, and it'll be interesting to hear from Isabel, whether it's a tale of 2 or 3 Hong Kongs. There is a Hong Kong which is, of course, having to grapple with security measures, this resignation that, of course, Hong Kong is a changed place. What does that also mean for the journalistic community, both, of course, foreign correspondents who are based there, as much as, of course, the domestic outlets, both English language and Chinese. I think that's one story. Then you have, of course, Hong Kong versus the rest of China, and I'm talking sort of in economic terms, because there are many parts of course, of the territory which are doing well, benefiting, of course, many people wanting to cross the border to shop, to do many things, and then, of course, likewise the other side too, which is, of course, prices and then just the state of the Chinese economy. This ongoing almost battle with Shenzhen at the moment, because people just flocking there at the weekends, and it's a very quick drive. It's 30-40 minutes to get to Shenzhen, and people going there for their massages, for their big blowout dinners. I mean, if you're in the world of luxury goods, there tends to be price parity, so there's not sort of savings if you go to one of the big luxury houses necessarily. But certainly if you want to buy other goods, if you're a Hong Konger, then there is an attraction, of course, to going over there. And then there's what continues to happen within the bubble. And I was at the Foreign Correspondents Club this week, and it was so buoyant and alive. I'm not sure if it was the free beer sampling, but it felt a little bit like the late 90s, which was pleasant. But of course, we know there's many other things surrounding that. Let's
bring Isabel in on that one. This sounds heartening news from a place where often you hear of tales of flight.
Well, I think I would agree that there are several Hong Kongs, and there are Hong Kongs which are continue to ride the wave. In Taipei, I met up with an old friend who has been suffering the other thing, really. She's the chief editor of Initium Media, which is a pretty middle of the road media organisation which services sort of Chinese news, and they've had to move out of Hong Kong. They went to Singapore, Taipei. Actually, interestingly enough, in Taipei now, you meet an awful lot of journalists, far more than you used to 10 years ago, because so many media operations have simply found Hong Kong too dangerous, and we've had very harsh, long sentences passed on people like Jimmy Lai and other prominent media types. So it's, as Tyler says, it's a mixed picture, and you see a Hong Kong diaspora springing up, and with various degrees of activity, but all across Asia, and indeed here in London.
So there is lots of movement going on, Tyler.
There is, but this is the curious thing as well. Is also, and maybe we're talking more about the expat community as well. People who are on the other side of it. They're not, in the business of media. Where, of course, there was that moment, during the pandemic. Of course, there was the whole, that Singapore wave that happened. That they were seen as the first country to sort of open up properly. They definitely cashed in on that. A lot of people, whether you worked for Deutsche Bank or UBS or any number of big financial institutions, people who went to Singapore, brought their families, that were happily transferred. But these last two trips, though, I've encountered people now who have, one member of the family has moved back. Maybe the kids are still in school and the partner is still living in Singapore. But a lot of people have also said, had enough with Singapore now. I have the ability to work in both places. And people are actually going back to Hong Kong as well.
So we've had lots of life springing up in Hong Kong, the absolute opposite in Bangkok. You then ended up in Tokyo.
Ended up in Tokyo, and of course, always good to be back. And hopefully our listeners have noticed as well, a ramping up of our audio operations as well. So both from Bangkok and from Tokyo, now doing news bulletins there. And this is, I would say, a bit of a step-up moment, which is happening, a dusting down of some of the audio equipment, and really looking at how we ramp things up out of Asia in general. And I think Isabel raises a very interesting point, because it's that question of, where do you want to, there's one thing, where do you want to base yourself as a media organization commercially? That's one question. Where is the most effective place to, of course, be running your partnerships and advertising from? Then it's a very different question, where do you want to do your news gathering from? And of course, we have Naomi based in Singapore, we've got James in Bangkok, and of course, we have Fiona up in Tokyo. And then it's fascinating to see also, CNN, many others, also putting people in Taipei now as well. I think the only challenge with, Taipei very well connected regionally, maybe not quite it's not a Hong Kong or Tokyo when it comes to long haul travel, and of course there's various issues. I imagine, Isabel, knowing your flight route, I think you must have been on EVA Airways.
I was indeed,
because all those flights have to go for various reasons, Taipei down to Bangkok, and then connect. Of course, across to Europe, whether you're flying to Vienna or many other cities. These are sort of age-old air treaty issues with China. But anyway, yeah. So I think it's. I sort of feel it's all up for grabs. And the one place that has gone quiet a little bit, there's all this excitement about Seoul and people moving their news operations to Seoul, etc. And I feel again that's also another place where even other organizations who moved some commercial people, even some editorial people out of Hong Kong, out of Tokyo, those people have found their way back to those cities after maybe trying Seoul out for a year. So I'm also just fascinated by the Taipei story, and would be wonderful to see if it can really establish itself properly, not just as a temporary hub, but for the foreseeable future, of course, as things get more interesting, as really a new hub and home for journalists, of course, internationally, and for the Taiwanese domestic services.
Tyler, I think Nina wants to have a word.
Yeah, I think it's really it's interesting, this point you're making, Tyler, about Hong Kong enjoying quite a revival. I used to have a team out there when I used to present 2 shows a day and have about 11 people working on the news gathering and also production side there. But I think, as you're pointing out, it's quite difficult to see in terms of visibility, who's stacking their resources where. And I think that has some impact on how you can hire, staff for production and also news gathering in some of these places. As Isabel was pointing out, the focus of the world is basically now going to be on Taiwan. After, of course, all of the sort of conflict journalists have been focusing on Ukraine for quite some time.
I think they will be moving back. Sorry, Tyler, just the other point that people made in Taipei was that although they were pleased to be away from the kind of, the new atmosphere, if you like, in Hong Kong, there was a big nostalgia for the place that Hong Kong was in the news gathering sense. And there are these moments when liminal spaces just become extremely dynamic in terms of information exchange. And Hong Kong was that place. Yeah. It was partly the kind of mixture of espionage, but also publishers, ideas, creatives, people who were close to China, but just beyond the reach. It was just a great moment. And it's very hard to replicate that actually anywhere else in Asia.
Tyler.
No, and just finally, Emma, I think it's a very good point, and maybe it's a good story as well, because I was when I was in Bangkok, we actually in the current issue we have quite a big story on Thailand's foreign ministry, and I was having a conversation with one of the attachés from the foreign ministry's team, and they were saying as well that they also see an opportunity for Thailand. As okay, we have to leave the king alone, but also, and of course, it is a big hub for AP, AFP, BBC expanding, and of course Isabel knows this very well, because they have all of these journalists who were once heading to work in a Beijing bureau, they just simply can't get visas. So you also have the situation of all of these people looking in on China, not able to, of course, go and staff these bureaus. So Bangkok is a very good example. You have an enormous China desk, and the same with, of course, other organizations as well, who can only sort of peer in, look from the outside, but are actually not on the ground, able to cover China properly.
Tyler, finally, what's on the cards for you this week? Slightly more earthbound?
Slightly, yes. I have a CEO to interview tomorrow from one of the world's biggest airline manufacturers, and then it's back to Zurich, and I think we'll probably wrap up the week. And I'm indeed back in Zurich next week. I don't know if we're co-anchoring what we're doing. I have to get to Budapest because it's that time of year when we move around. But it's the Distripress Jamboree this year in Hungary, and that of course is the major global event dedicated to all of those people who have the business of getting actual newspapers and magazines into people's hands every day.
Tyler Brûlé, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Stockholm. It's 17 minutes past 9. Let's look, Isabel, at your trip to Taipei. What was the purpose? And actually, you weren't just in Taipei, were you? You went and sort of delved around and had a couple of interesting sorties.
I did. I had two interesting out-of-town excursions. One was to a major whiskey distillery, which is a Scot. I was quite alarmed about the whiskey distillery producing 2 million bottles a day of quite decent stuff. But the more sort of the strategic one was that I went to Kinmen, which is one of those islands. There are two islands that are relatively well known for the non specialists, and they're Kinmen and Jinmin and Matsu, Quemoy and Matsu. Chinese dialects complicated, so they have different names. These are literally, just over a mile off the shore. So you can easily see, you're standing on Kinmen, you can look across at Xiamen, at the great skyscrapers of this very busy coastal port in China. And it is just extraordinary. It's much closer to the mainland than it is to the main island of Taiwan. And both of those were shelled, some decades ago on a regular basis from the mainland. So Kinmen is just this maze of tunnels carved into granite, enormous networks of tunnels which were carved there by Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang leader, back in the 60s. And they sort of reenact military maneuvers for tourists in these tunnels. It is quite extraordinary. When I asked a local lady whether they weren't just a little afraid of the mainland today, since there was this, extraordinary military history, she basically said, no, we're too small. They really want the big island, so they're not going to bother with us.
So they can play war.
They play war for tourists. Meanwhile, there's I watched, 6 people dressed in uniform pretending to fire an enormous gun, which had it been live would have hit the ferry that goes from Kinmen to Xiamen on a daily basis carrying commuters. It's like a 20-minute ferry ride. It's quite bizarre.
Why do they do that? Because one would imagine that in that region there is no shortage of characters who like to flex their military muscles and like to, lob a missile here or ram a Philippine vessel, fishing vessel there. Yet to actually have a sort of a dedicated play-acting bang-bang setup on a tiny island, to me suggests perhaps Taiwan should maybe focus its energies and its military energies on the more pressing issue of the fact that they are literally a mile from mainland China, and China does like to rattle sabres.
Well, there is the question of how many of these many tunnels are still occupied by serious military operations, which of course no one will actually tell you. But the turning of I mean, there were so many tunnels. They had tunnels for ships. You know, you could sail directly in from the ocean to repair your ships. They had one set of tunnels is so extensive it now hosts an annual 2-day music festival. You know, it is quite extraordinary. And so I guess, you know, now there isn't much else on Kinmen except a large brewery of Gaoliang liquor. That's their tourist pitch, you know, and people go and sort of enact 1960s tensions. It is quite strange.
Did you see any of them? Did you sign up for
I
any?
did. I absolutely
what
watched
did they
the
do?
firing. Well, they, as I say, you sit there and these people march in and kind of do a few manoeuvres, and then they pretend to fire a very, very large cannon, which goes off with a very big bang, fortunately blank, at the mainland.
And everybody cheers and goes and has a glass of whiskey.
Everyone's had a lovely time, yes.
What a lovely time. What an amazing holiday occupation
God, that was
to have.
fun. That was fun, actually.
I mean, the most I can ever hope for is, you know, a little trip on a ferry across the Zürichsee when I go on holiday. I don't go and see large military manoeuvres. It's quite an amazing thought, isn't it?
This is a bit like a combination of Dad's army on, you know, Sark or something like that, isn't it?
Well, yes, very much. Imagine, Guernsey, after all, was occupied. I mean, imagine if they were reenacting the German invasion of Jersey or Guernsey for tourism. It's sort of like that, only rather closer.
I think
with Germany still an active, as it were.
I think we're all signing up for a trip there. That sounds amazing fun. Apart from seeing reenactments or pretend war, what was the purpose of the trip to Taipei? What were you seeing and doing and saying?
Well, essentially, I mean, there is a real prospect of war, of course. And you know, famously, economists describe Taipei as the most dangerous place in the world. And again, it's a bit like the reports from Kyiv just before the Russian invasion. Life is very normal. It goes on. And people who are in these extremely exposed situations tend to say, well, look, if I worried about it, I'd just get very, very anxious and depressed. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm living my life. But if you talk to government and officials, you know, kind of overarching this normal life, there is a kind of great web of national and international security manoeuvres going on, particularly around the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and this is constantly shifting. So we had German warships exercising their freedom of navigation operations this week. We have a very constant American presence, which is probably military, but nobody quite talks about it. We have the Chinese setting up, as a sort of counter move against Japan's support for Taiwan, they've set up a new institute for the study of Okinawa. Why would they want to study Okinawa? Because they're challenging Japanese sovereignty over Okinawa, which of course has been a big US military base. And that's a kind of one of these counter maneuvers. If you're going to query Taiwan, we're going to query Okinawa. We're all going to have to learn the geography of these islands, which is complicated, but it's the new map of international tensions.
It's not just the Spratly Islands then, isn't it? And, you know, sunken or Philippine vessels run aground to basically just, you know, keep Chinese sovereignty claims at bay, right?
Precisely. So yes, I mean, China is in contention with all its neighbours about the South China Sea.
And we have all this being focused on at the UN General Assembly.
We have. Taiwan's concern at the UN General Assembly every year, of course, is that it's not a member of the UN. And so amongst many people who make many arguments about Taiwan, there is a civil society group who every year stage demonstrations in New York and lobby diplomats and lobby friendly countries for the admission of Taiwan to the UN as a member or an observer. That would mean that, for example, Taiwan could participate in the World Health Organization, which mattered a great deal, you know, over COVID. And Taiwan complains, we told the world about COVID, but you ignored us because we're not a member of the World Health Organization. So there are lots of reasons why Taiwan ought to be part of these bodies. But of course, China has a veto it can't even get debated. You know, China's a permanent 5 member. And so in a way, it's like a lot lot of things that go on in Taiwan. You feel that the arguments have logic, they have, history on their side, they have all sorts of reasons why they should be taken seriously, but the realpolitik is that they won't be.
And there is that discussion, isn't there, that while you are not allowed to discuss it in those terms on the main floor, that does not stop the sideline discussions from happening.
Exactly. So there's a lot of lobbying, but I mean, it covers everything from climate, for example, where China's not really allowed to, Taiwan's not allowed to participate in the Conference of the Parties, but in the green zone, they're highly active, they're cool, they're visible, they host meetings. So they put in all this effort in a kind of shadow world. But if any country were to admit this discussion to the main floor of the UN, they know that China's wrath would descend on them in a kind of major way. And China argues that the settlement which gave the permanent seat from the Republic of China, Taiwan, to China after the American shift in diplomatic recognition permanently excluded Taiwan. Taiwan has a long legal argument, says that's not the case. It doesn't mention Taiwan. And there were 2 Germanys, there were 2 Koreas in the UN, so why not 2 Chinas? But they didn't make it at the time, and it's too late now.
Nina, what have you spotted in the papers today?
Well, I'm interested to hear Isabel talk about essentially buffer states. That's what we're talking about here, isn't it? And we're heading towards winter in Ukraine. President Zelensky's refreshed his cabinet again with one of his sort of slightly ruthless manoeuvres to concentrate power. 5 years into his presidency with no prospect of elections anytime soon. And so countries like Ukraine as well, how are under huge pressure to try and settle the war, I think, and there'll be some discussions probably on the sidelines of how potentially that could happen at the UN General Assembly. And however that happens in the future, whether it's sooner rather than later and under what conditions, will obviously set the scene for whatever might happen in the South China Sea and Taiwan as well.
This is referring, if I'm correct, to an article in the Times the Sunday Times from this weekend. The great diplomatic editor of the BBC's Newsnight programme, Mark Urban, is no longer at Newsnight. He's moved to the Sunday Times, and his first article for the Sunday Times since joining the paper, it has the headline, "Now Russia and Ukraine edging towards an endgame. Troop shortages and fatigue may force a reluctant Putin and Zelensky to the negotiating table, and who will make the first move?" And it's a really excellent question to ask, isn't it? I mean, how does this thing end? And the catalogue of problems and struggles and exhaustion and indeed depleted troops and lack of willpower and lack of anything on both sides now.
And question marks over support from places like the United States and whether or not they'll be allowed to use those long-range ATACMS missiles to strike into Russian territory, to take out the really, really damaging facilities that are launching glide bombs towards Ukraine with devastating effect from Russia. All of these questions, still floating up in the air, as Isabel was just pointing out before, just a few days before we head towards the UNGA. It's an excellent piece that Mark has written, obviously. He's one of the foremost diplomatic correspondents and thinkers in the UK, hugely respected and very knowledgeable about Ukraine. Indeed, he himself was once a soldier, so he really knows his stuff on this militarily. But it's a question everybody's asking, but nobody can seem to answer, because I think it depends a huge amount on Zelensky's own thinking. As we know, he sort of, demands full loyalty and changed his cabinet to make sure that he can, hone the message ahead of the UNGA. But about, Mark is pointing out in his piece, about 15,000 young soldiers have been accused of desertion in Ukraine as people are getting, war weary. And at the same time, while there might be some people who may be willing to strike a peace deal in Ukraine, it's Zelensky would have to distance himself legally from any of the difficulties of any of those, any of those negotiations, because he could be done for treason. And then at the same time, there's a lot of young people, Mark is pointing out, who he's also interviewed in Ukraine, who say, no, fight to the death, the last drop, the last inch of Ukrainian territory has to come back under sovereignty. And there'll be huge amounts of animosity between Ukrainians and Russians for generations to come. That's another big question. Thereafter, what happens?
Indeed, and I think as Mark's article excellently points out, the trouble is that the Ukrainians cannot possibly face the idea of a compromise, which one can understand if your country has been invaded. And your country has been invaded by the Russians, who you have a very difficult relationship with and have done for arguably centuries. The idea of giving anything to Moscow and to Putin is absolutely, it's inconceivable.
Yes, I agree. And that's part of this very, very complicated set of manoeuvres that we see going on. And I think, that sense, it is a very good piece by Mark, and that sense that actually what we're doing now is trying to set up the best possible position for the negotiating table. Because, it's not a contradiction to say that talks are imminent and the fighting becomes more intense. That's exactly when the fighting becomes more intense, because you don't want to go to the negotiating table with a weak hand. How far Zelensky could, in the end, settle, land for peace is one of the many, many unknowns. And were he to do so, were they to reach a compromise arrangement, would Russia respect it? Russia hasn't respected any deal it's done for decades. It's a long record of invading its neighbours. And it's not just Ukraine that would be concerned. If Russia were to feel that it had gained, if Putin were to feel that he had gained something from this whole exercise, would it encourage him to, make trouble elsewhere in the Balts or whatever in the future? Or would he be so chastened and sobered by the cost of this that would be it for now, at least? So then you add in the relationship again with Xi Jinping and Putin. How far is China prepared to go to make sure that Putin doesn't fall? How much?
They seem to be going further recently,
they're going steadily further. And, how does that play into the calculations? What deal can be done that gives Putin enough that his position is secure, which bizarrely could be something that we end up wishing to be true, rather than the chaos that might follow if he fell, and the kind of reaction of China. So a very, very, very messy situation.
As I was saying before, obviously there's a lot riding on it as a test case for Taiwan, and how far the West would go, and particularly the United States, to help Taiwan repel China if it were to invade. But also there's a lot riding on what happens in Ukraine and those negotiations, or at least any sort of tentative negotiations or talk of them at the United Nations General Assembly, because a few days after that we've got elections taking place in Moldova, another key state between Ukraine and the EU, where you might see the spectre of Russian interference, and Georgia as well as being dragged back into the Russian sphere of influence. Now this is crucial because
already having suffered Russian invasion too.
Indeed, which was the precursor, many people obviously will say, to the Ukraine war and the invasion in the first place of Crimea. But the point is that there are some countries that the EU has extended association agreements to that potentially could become EU member states, but are now being dragged back into the Russian orbit and becoming less democratic, like, for instance, Georgia and possibly Moldova in October when they have their elections.
In a tiny way, let's head now to a country which is moving further away from the European Union and actively seeking to buddy up with the likes of Russia and China. We head now to Turkey for the latest headlines from Istanbul. Monocle's correspondent in the region, Lucinda Smith, joins us on the line now. A very good morning to you, Hannah. How's Istanbul looking this morning?
Good morning. Well, I think we're finally reaching the end of the summer here. The weather in the past few days is just starting to turn. So I think probably you're not going to have much sympathy in Britain. But I think we're coming to the end of the heat wave that we've had here.
OK, fair enough. Enough said. We were mentioning a moment ago this issue of countries inside Europe which find themselves pulled towards the European Union, but also pulled dreadfully also back to Moscow. Turkey is deciding that it wants a little bit of both, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Turkey's in a sort of different position to the countries that you've just been talking about, in that it doesn't have this kind of history of Russian interference. It was never part of the Soviet Union. It was always more the kind of regional rival of Russia. And, you know, even as late as 2016, President Erdogan was still talking about the sort of threat of an expanding Russia. He said at some point, you know, the Black Sea is turning into a Russian lake. He sounds very different today. Of course, you know, since then, he has moved closer to President Putin as he's moved away in many respects from the Western institutions that Turkey is either a member of, such as NATO, or aspired to be a member of, such as the European Union. It is still, of course, a NATO member. It is also still an EU candidate country. But increasingly, it's looking towards the east and towards Russia, particularly for kind of economic boosts. And the latest aspect of this is the news that Turkey is going to apply to become a member of the BRICS bloc in October when Russia hosts that summit. Now, it will be the first NATO country to do that. That's obviously going to raise some concerns in the Western capitals, particularly in Washington, which has already warned Turkey over its continuing economic relationship with Russia. There was a threat of secondary sanctions on Turkey last year to do with with Turkey's hosting of Russian businesses, and also the plan to have a Russian gas hub here in Turkey, which could potentially allow Russian gas to keep flowing to Europe under a kind of different guise. But from Turkey's perspective, you know, Turkey has always been this kind of in-between country. It's been a member of NATO for a really long time, since 1952, and that's a geographic consideration. It's you know, on NATO's eastern flank in Europe. It's the kind of buffer between the countries within the European mainland and within both the Soviet Union and also the old Soviet Union and the Middle East. But also, you know, it does try to play this mediating role. You know, Turkey always says, you know, we are in this neighborhood, this very, very turbulent neighborhood, Middle East, Iran, former Soviet Union, and it has to keep some kind of relations with those countries. But more than that, it can also play a kind of mediating role. And we've seen Turkey, of course, do that in the Ukraine conflict, particularly earlier on. So, you know, this application to BRICS, is it a full turn away from the West? No, absolutely not. You know, Europe is still Turkey's most important trading partner. But I think it's, you know, kind of from Turkey's view, a kind of diversification of its interests. Whether that is in its interest in the long term is a kind of more complicated question.
Indeed, because if you have membership of NATO, you're in the waiting room for the European Union, and you are also part of BRICS. Is this a recipe for trying to be friends with too many people and failing, or actually a recognition of the way that the modern world works?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you talk to the, let's say, more old school Turkish diplomats, many of whom are now retiring from the diplomatic service, they would certainly go for the former. You know, the traditional view within the Turkish state was always that Turkey should be looking westwards and that it should be prioritising its relationships with Western institutions and Western countries. And there is a certain amount of discomfort about the extent to which Erdogan has changed that, particularly because, again, if you look historically, you know, Turkey and Russia have always been rivals in this region. They've never had a particularly comfortable relationship. And it is still the case that Putin is by far the more powerful player in this relationship. Russia is far bigger. It has huge gas reserves, and it just has the ability to kind of dominate Turkey in a way that Turkey doesn't have to dominate Russia. So there are people in this country who, you know, are very, very uncomfortable with the way this is going and are, you know, wondering where it might end up. And
Isabel, just bringing you into this one, because China would absolutely love to have closer relationships with Turkey for economic and trade reasons, surely.
Well, that's true, but I mean, I absolutely agree that Turkey, you know, plays a canny game. Last week, for example, Erdogan said that Crimea should be returned to Ukraine and shouldn't stay with Russia, which is, of course, not something that Putin wanted to hear. So that they continue to try to position themselves to be useful and without being captured. And the Chinese relationship is complicated by Xinjiang, because these are Turkic people who have looked, they've looked westward to Turkey for their religious and cultural origins, and Turkey was a little bit robust in the beginning of the repression of the Uyghurs, but lately has been pretty quiet about it. So, it's a country that is more important in some ways than it was, because the whole geopolitical focus has moved to its neighborhood. But it's still trying to parley its relationships with the big powers in a way that doesn't commit it to one or the other.
And may I just say, it's interesting, obviously, that this we're seeing this expansion of the BRICS. Basically, it's the global south, isn't it, challenging the Western-led hegemony. And we've got countries like, for instance, Ethiopia now considering joining the BRICS, countries in North Africa like Morocco. So it's not just that Brazil, Russia, India, China big economy model. They're getting a diplomatic and trading footprint in all these other different parts of the world, and they can trade with countries like China and Russia, and the world can do nothing about it.
You're absolutely right. And it's one of many, many diplomatic initiatives that China's taken over the past 10 years that we pay insufficient attention to. I mean, last week, 80 African leaders were in Beijing again for the FOCAC summit. When did any Western capital host 80 African leaders? We've seen the map just be redrawn quietly by China's just building up a parallel set of diplomatic relationships, of which the BRICS was one of the first. Now, you may say that these are broad but not deep, and that's true, but they're very useful. And if you want to mobilize votes in the UN General Assembly, for example, look at the trading relationships that big powers have. China is the biggest trade partner of most of the General Assembly now. So every country, when confronted with what is increasingly American pressure to pick a side, is going to say, well, hang on a minute. I'm not sure I want to pick a side. And if you're going to force me, it wouldn't necessarily be your side. So the diplomatic game is very much a changed game these days.
Hannah, let's move on to another story on a completely different note, but rather unpleasant. A lot of dead fish. What's going on?
Yeah, extremely unpleasant. So this is in the Bay of Izmir, which is on Turkey's Aegean coast. Over the past few weeks, there have been thousands of dead fish washing up at various points. As you can imagine, not a particularly pleasant sight or smell, and the local authorities are doing everything they can to clear that. But the reason behind that is to do with two things. It's to do with the particularly hot summer that we've had here in Turkey and, of course, across the rest of the Mediterranean region, and also to do with pollution in the water. What seems to have happened is that there has been an overgrowth of plankton in the waters around Izmir. That's taken all the oxygen from the water, and that's basically sort of deprived the fish of oxygen, and they have died. We had something quite similar here in Istanbul during the pandemic, not dead fish, but we had a plague of what is charmingly referred to as sea snot, colloquially. This is a kind of mucus that forms on the surface of the water. Again, smells very, very bad. It's the kind of remnants of things that live beneath the sea surface, not fish, but other things like plankton and algae, dying, then coming to the surface, and unfortunately it creates a bit of a cycle. It blocks out the sunlight from the rest of the water, and then it gets into a bit of a cycle, and again that's caused by pollution, and it's caused by rising sea temperatures. Now, pollution is something that environmental activists in Turkey are really worried about. There's been this absolute boom of construction, particularly along the western coasts, of huge hotels, tourism infrastructure, and that is, of course, changing the balance of the environment. There's also some concerns that some of these hotels may not be dealing with their waste entirely correctly, that there's sort of raw sewage deposits into the sea and things like that, and we are seeing the effects of that. So, yeah, in the immediate sense, not a great thing for the people of Izmir to have to deal with, and in the long term, really a worrying sign of the kind of economic impacts of overdevelopment here in Turkey.
And also, when you deal with it locally, who is actually taking responsibility or taking the lead on trying to fix this problem? Because, as you say, if you've got the tourist operators, they're going to want to continue to to do business, the environmentalists are going to say, hang on, we have a bigger problem here. And one wonders what the municipal authorities are doing to try to sort of carve a path through it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of political aspect to this story. The local authorities in Izmir, as on much of the western coast, are opposition controlled very strongly. They are kind of opposition strongholds. So, of course, for them, there's this political element as well. They're sort of left to deal with it, while the planning decisions to, in a lot of cases, actually rezone areas that should be natural protected areas. They shouldn't be built on. That decision is being taken at the national level. These are decrees that are coming out of the presidency, often at sort of 1 or 2 in the morning, literally just rezoning areas. This is concerning not only the environmentalists, but also the local authorities as well, because they're the ones who have to pick up the tab.
Finally, tell us about something that's happening in Istanbul in terms of what the mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, is doing to try to sort of to bring in places of worship as a more sort of like significant part of city life, which is pretty significant anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you think about religion in Turkey, it probably looks fairly kind of monolithic. And in fact, you have different types of Muslims here in Turkey. There are the Sunni Muslims, who are the majority. They are President Erdogan, of course, is one of them, and he is from a particularly conservative part of the Sunni Muslim community, and it's the mosques that have increasingly been appearing everywhere here under President Erdogan's watch. They serve the Sunni Muslim community. But you also have a minority of Alawi Muslims. They comprise about 15 to 20% of the Turkish population, so it's not a small number in any sense. And they are far more closely linked, actually, to Shia Islam, the kind of Islam that you find in Iran. But they are very, very special and unique type of Islam in that they drink alcohol. It's not banned in Alawi in the Alawi religion. Men and women pray together in places called the Cemevi. So this is distinct from the mosque. It's more of a kind of gathering place. The women don't cover their heads. They pray together. It's a very kind of mystic ritual that they perform. And you find Cemevis everywhere. There are parts of the country where there are more Alawi, particularly in the east, also in central Anatolia, in a province called Nevşehir, you'll find one of the most sacred sites at a place called Hacı Bektaş. But also in Istanbul, there are very large communities of Alawi, and they have their Cemevis. Now, until, still on a national level, the Cemevi are not considered a place of worship. They're considered as cultural monuments. And this is not only a kind of symbolic thing, it also means that you don't get the same kind of protection and funding from the central religious agency that you do if you are considered a place of worship. Now, Istanbul, which again is opposition run, the mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was voted in 2019, displacing President Erdogan's party. He has decided that on a municipal level, the Cemevi in Istanbul are going to be recognised as places of worship. Now, this is clearly symbolic, and it's quite interesting. İmamoğlu himself is not Alawi. He is a Sunni Muslim, and he's from the Black Sea region originally, which is a very kind of conservative Sunni region. But within his party, the CHP, the Alawis do have a very, very strong voice. And in fact, the former party leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who was the presidential candidate last year, is himself an Alawi and has spoken quite openly about that. He broke something of a taboo in the run-up to those elections by talking very openly about that. Within his own party, İmamoğlu does know the importance of reaching out to that Alawi community, particularly as it's quite clear that İmamoğlu is positioning himself to be the candidate in the next presidential elections. So I think, on a symbolic level, it is a very, very important step. And I think, for, building these kind of cross-community relations in Istanbul, which is such a melting pot of the entire country, it's very important. But I think, it really says something as well about İmamoğlu's own ambitions.
Hannah Lucinda Smith in Istanbul. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle on Sunday. It's 9:49 here in London. Nina dos Santos and Isabel Hilton are around the table for today's episode. Nina, you wanted to draw our attention to a story about what's happening in Japanese prisons.
Hannah, this is quite an interesting one. It's in the Guardian or the Observer today, talking about how, as we all know, Japan is one of the fastest ageing populations in the world, and that brings obviously lots of issues, with people living longer, lots of care bills. The birth rate is plunging as a result. But we never think about what happens in prisons. And they've got this really interesting piece about how somebody's been behind bars, essentially watching all the aging Yakuzas, do their crosswords. And the Japanese prison age population has just gone up enormously, which brings all of these different issues. They don't have to deal necessarily with violence in prisons, but they do have to deal with all sorts of geriatric care in prisons. And I just thought that was a really thought-provoking piece, because it's just not something that we talk about in this part of the world at all.
Well, what's quite interesting is that they've actually, they're two things. One, they're training the younger inmates to become effectively carers for the elderly. But the people we're talking about here, this is the Yakuzas who are getting arthritis and joint problems, isn't it?
Yeah, and apparently they're quite easy to spot, this journalist says, because they have their sort of standard issue white vest, but all the tattoos underneath, with the skin presumably a bit saggy by now, I'm afraid. But I suppose the whole piece sort of radiates this strange, aged calm, which is not what you're used to hearing about when you're talking about large prisons. So obviously, we're talking about prisons a lot here in the UK, where I am, we are today, obviously, because there's huge concerns over overcrowding and, lack of capacity, especially after lots of people were locked up during the riots that happened in the first month of Keir Starmer's time in office. And the UK is going to consider, or at least the previous government was considering, renting prison space from other countries like Estonia. But Japan has a completely different issue here, as I was saying before, because of the demographics have changed so much. It's all calmed down a bit. But they do say in this piece that, the question I had when I was reading it was, well, why don't they just let all these old people out? and apparently they were persistent offenders. So whether or not, they'd moved from violent crime to shoplifting, it seems that might well have been the case.
But when you think about it, it's actually, just reading this article, which paints a very beautiful and rather elegantly vivid picture of what happens in these Japanese prisons. They talk about the absence of overcrowding, absence of drug abuse, absence of violence.
And the folded sheets, apparently, first thing in the morning. Everybody making their bed.
Exercise bikes, throwing bean bags to make sure that your mobility stays. I mean, it doesn't sound a million miles off the average old people's home in quite a lot of places.
Can we apply?
Frankly, I'm signing up for this because, okay, maybe the Yakuzas might make things a little bit edgier than normal, and the tattoos might be sort of, liven things up, and that might make the difference. But frankly, if you are old and frail, you need looking after, you need plenty of support. This doesn't sound like too bad an idea to me.
But I suppose in a place like Japan, where the average longevity is continuing to go up. Obviously, Japan, there's been other pieces in the UK newspapers over the last week talking about how Japan has more centenarians than anywhere else in the world. There was a profile of a marathon runner who's still running at, over 100 and still winning medals. So obviously, presumably, they have to have a think about whether or not people do fulfill their sentences till longer, because obviously in Western countries, very often age is taken into account with regard to sentencing. And the other thing that's interesting about this piece is it's not just the age of the inmates they're talking about, it's the demographic makeup as well, because obviously as Japan's birth rate is shrinking, the population is shrinking, they're bringing in more people from outside, more immigration. And so there's more younger foreign inmates as well, which is kind of upsetting the apple cart apparently a bit.
Let's talk about another story that we spotted in the Times. This is kind of on your perch because you are Dutch, half Dutch. There's a bit of Dutch.
Not much, but...
Not much Dutch, but enough for me to ask you about bicycles.
Fiets, as they call them in Dutch. Fiets.
Fiets.
That's what you call a bicycle in
Ladies
Dutch.
And gentlemen,
Een fiets.
We've learned We've learned Dutch today. Thank you. Who says that Monocle Radio isn't informative and helpful? This article in the Times talks about this love of Dutch cycling, but as has happened in so many places, the fallout from the electric bike has actually become a bit of a problem. And there's this thing called fat bikes, which are...
In vetfiets.
Vetfiets. The knowledge just keeps coming. This is brilliant. Vetfiets. They're causing a big fit problem, aren't they?
Yes, I was really surprised actually by this story because my recollection of spending years in the Netherlands as a young kid and later on in my teens was that actually everything was very cordial in the bike lanes. And what's really surprising when you go there is people don't want one of these, vetfiets, as you say, with the big tyres. What they want is, the most beaten up bike you can find that you don't even have to lock up. Possibly, your granny's tulips painted on the side or something. That's sort of a mark of prestige. If you've got young children, then you might have one of those big bikes with the contraption on the front. Backfeets, I think they're called, to put your children in.
Put your children in a box.
Yeah, but it's, the concept of having an electric bike to go anywhere a huge amount faster than anybody else is managing to pedal is actually bad etiquette in the bike lane in the Netherlands. So I was really surprised that they have a problem with this. And apparently, just like here in the UK, more and more people are getting knocked over by these bikes going over 30 miles an hour.
And ridden by 10-year-olds.
I think this
is the problem. So it takes a little bit of a while to work out what the nub of the issue is in this article, because it talks about the general problem of having faster bicycles, the fact that the electric bike is widely considered to be the answer to the car, because you whiz around, well, for obvious reasons, you whiz around faster. But the difficulty with these things is that they don't seem to be ridden by grown-ups, do they, Isabel? These are like between 10 and 14-year-olds. And no one's wearing a helmet. And there's a big issue, apparently, and I was unaware of this. I think you were unaware of this too, weren't you, Nina? That the Dutch have an issue with wearing a helmet. They don't like their hair to get ruffled.
Oh dear. I think really what we're looking at here is a teenage tearaway problem expressed through bicycle culture.
On two wheels.
Yeah, it's a two-wheeled teenage tearaway problem. And so I'm not sure that dealing with the bikes is going to fix it.
No,
I think it's the eternal problem of dealing with the teenagers.
As the article says, they'll be getting rid of vetfiets soon enough and getting
I'm not sure what they call them over there.
Well, they're getting skinny bikes. So what's skinny bike in?
I don't know. In German it would be a Schlankrad.
Schlankrad.
Like a slim bike.
Hang on.
I don't know.
We'll look it up in the dictionary later. Finally, we've got 1.5 minutes, Nina, to talk about Dolly Parton's cookbook.
It's called Good Looking Cooking.
Bet it is.
And she's, at 78, written a cookbook with her youngest of 12 siblings, or 11 siblings. I think she was one of a dozen children growing up in Tennessee. And her sister's 65. And they've written this cookbook about sort of southern cooking. I had a look at some of the recipes, and I've got to say, they look hearty, but not, terribly jazzy. It's things like sort of grilled chicken and a crumbly apple pie. But, good for her, because as we know, Dolly Parton is the ultimate sort of survivor in the world of entertainment. And this is another revival act of hers taking on cooking this time.
I love it. It says, don't get us wrong, we're not perfect cooks. There may still be some spaghetti stuck to the ceiling and a spot or two of red sauce on the walls of my home. What are they doing in there?
I shudder to think. But actually, I find the idea that Dolly Parton has spent any time in the kitchen over the past 40 years faintly unlikely.
Slaving 9 to 5.
Yeah, right.
The cooker, right?
Very funny. Actually, you're quite right there. I'm not as patient as my sister in the kitchen. She says, I don't always want to put in the time she does, but a nice marinade doesn't take long and does all the work. Wise words from Dolly Parton. On that note, it is time to say the warmest of thanks to all my guests today, Nina dos Santos, Isabel Hilton, Hannah Lucinda Smith and Tyler Brûlé. Thanks to you for listening. The programme was produced and studio engineered by Mariella Bevan. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday is back next week. But until then, goodbye and enjoy the rest of your weekend.